Maybe we should stop for a moment and inspect the makeup of the atmosphere. It is mostly made up of nitrogen and oxygen. Water vapor, the leading greenhouse gas, makes up 1%, and CO2, carbon dioxide, is just a trace gas. 0.04%. You have to wonder how a trace gas like this could possibly have such a profound impact on temperature. Well, the global warming crowd says that CO2 is like pepper, I guess. A little bit goes a long way. And they tell us that's because of a concept which they have named radiative forcing. You would get the feeling that there must be something to it, since hundreds of scientists in the last 60 years have published hundreds of studies that either explain or support or are based on the concept of warming caused by CO2 through radiative forcing. Well, this is really important. It is a cornerstone on which is built the entire global warming theory. They contend that via radiative forcing, carbon dioxide, which makes up less than 0.5% of our atmosphere, becomes a super greenhouse gas that is responsible for unstoppable, rapid global warming that will render our planet unlivable. Now remember, the records, even as manipulated by the global warming advocate scientist, only shows a warming of less than a degree, well, maybe slightly over a degree, since 1880, and the temperature anomalies here are in tenths of a degree. But nonetheless, they are constantly bombarding us with claims that as a result of warming, the Arctic ice cap is rapidly melting and will vanish within 3 decades. And they play on our emotions by telling us, as a result, the polar bears are dying. And they frighten us by telling us rising oceans will engulf our shoreline, cities, and towns. They tell us warming will lead to catastrophic superstorms that will wipe out our cities and kill tens of thousands. And they imply Katrina was caused by global warming, and we haven't seen anything yet. And they tell us hundreds of thousands will starve as drought wipes out our farm crops. And they say hundreds of thousands more will die in massive heat waves. Well, the years pass, and the warnings are repeated over and over again, but none of the predictions has actually come to pass. Radiative forcing doesn't really seem to be destroying our climate at all. So what proof of their theory do they actually have? What have they produced? None. They have a vote of the climate change panel at the UN, and they have their computer models, but they programmed those models with radiative forcing and their assumptions. That doesn't make it real. The truth is that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is dominated by politicians and bureaucrats and environmental activists, with an anti-fossil fuel and tax the rich nations to fund the one world government agenda. The scientists there, the small number, all make their living off the global warming research, and their very livelihood depends on global warming. And anyway, in science, folks, a vote is not proof. You must have factual, irrefutable evidence, and they simply don't have it. When I make this point in conversation, people usually immediately ask me about the glaciers. They are melting, people say, and that's proof of global warming. You need to understand that this is an interglacial period, and it is natural for the glaciers to be melting. It has nothing to do with the burning of fossil fuels. Much of the Earth was covered by a very deep ice sheet when the last ice age ended. The ice has melted and melted and melted, and yes, there is still ice in the form of glaciers at many locations. May I ask you, what is the natural or normal extent of the glaciers? The size they were in, let's say, year 1 A.D., the way they were in 1970, the way they are now? You see, the melting of ice is not a global warming crisis. When it is warm and the ice is melting, life of all forms on Earth thrives. Don't be panicked by scare talk. Relax and enjoy our warm period. Oh, and by the way, the Antarctic ice cap, the one at the South Pole, is near the highest point since we've been measuring it by satellite starting in the late 70s. And despite all the wild scare claims about the ice cap at the North Pole, it had melted to a low point since the satellite measurements began back in 2007. But it has been increasing ever since. Here is a chart of the North Pole and the ice there. The dip in 2007 in black shows up well, and the return of the recent normal range in subsequent years is clear. There's no big deal there. I have researched how the global warming scare got started. That makes quite a story. It all started in the mid-1950s, honestly and innocently, at this great spot, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California, on the north coastal edge of San Diego. A great scientist, Roger Revelle, who was the head of Scripps, hired Hans Suess, and the two collaborated to publish a research paper. That paper speculated that carbon dioxide might be a significant greenhouse gas, and they concluded that further research was needed. Their concept hit like a tidal wave, however, with bureaucrats and politicians and environmentalists, and the research dollars began to flow far and wide. Soon scientists everywhere were trying to make the case that fossil fuels were changing our climate. At Scripps, Dr. David Keeling set up the first CO2 measuring observatory out in Hawaii, and thus began the Keeling curve, now continued under the stewardship of David's son, Dr. Ralph Keeling. The global warming bandwagon was on parade throughout the climate research community, and Maurice Strong, a bureaucrat at the United Nations, took note of all of this, and he organized an international conference on climate at Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. His goal was one world government, and to fund his plan, he envisioned the developed nations being taxed for their use of fossil fuels to the benefit of the undeveloped nations, and to fund the one world government. His work led to the now much publicized United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Meanwhile, Roger Revelle had moved from Scripps to Harvard to establish a Center for Population Studies. And by happenstance, oh yes, this happenstance changed history, a student named Albert Gore signed up for one of his classes. Well, Revelle used the carbon dioxide study he had done as an example of mankind's impact on the planet, and Gore had found a cause célèbre that would dominate his future life. Al Gore, who became a U.S. Senator, while running for vice president in 1992, put out his book titled Earth in the Balance. It credited Roger Revelle for sounding the alarm about fossil fuels and CO2 and global warming. But by that time, Dr. Revelle had become somewhat skeptical about the threat to the climate from CO2. He wrote to Congressman Tim Bates that CO2 impacted human beings in both positive and negative ways, and he cautioned Congressman Tim Wirth that we should be careful not to arouse too much alarm about CO2 until the amount of warming became clearer. And then Revelle joined two other scientists in authoring an article for a new science magazine called Cosmos, in which they argued, go slow on global warming because the science is not settled. But Al Gore was not listening. He dismissed Revelle as senile and said that the debate was over. Global warming had become a Democrat campaign issue, and Al Gore was the spokesman for the cause. And then he wrote a second book titled An Inconvenient Truth. And then in 2002 came the movie by the same title, and the global warming scare campaign was moving at top speed. It seemed as though everyone believed. Al Gore was preaching doom and gloom to every impressionable young person in the nation. And when the newspapers, TV networks, and magazines all climbed aboard with Al Gore and the UN's IPCC, the global warming scare was in high gear. Meanwhile, the United Nations kept the global warming story rolling with a series of fancy conferences at glamorous locations around the world, where they published a continuing series of research reports. And here in the United States, the federal government was on the publicity wave with constant claims that global warming had taken control of our climate. Al Gore was on top of the world. An Inconvenient Truth won an Oscar in 2007. And then it all peaked when Al Gore and the UN IPCC were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But hardly noticed by the media, thousands of scientists were uniting to declare that the entire frenzy was based on bad science. We all knew that the claims about carbon dioxide causing out-of-control global warming were wrong, dead wrong. Also somewhat ignored by the media in the years that followed were a series of amazing conferences where global warming skeptics were invited to make their case. And at these conferences, the answer was loud and clear: there is no significant man-made global warming. They are cooking the books. The skeptical scientists named the men, many of them, who were behind these questionable global warming data and showed how their organizations were doing it. These scientists and their institutions, it seems, in my opinion, are dependent on the global warming research dollar, and they're doing what it takes to keep it rolling. It was at the Heartland Conference that important scientists who rejected the carbon dioxide global warming theory were at last given a platform to make their case. A standout among them was Fred Singer, one of the scientists who had co-authored that important Cosmos article with Roger Revelle, and then had been battling the UN IPCC and the greenhouse theory for more than 30 years. And then there was this young professor, Willie Soon from Harvard, who was working to explain how the sun and other astronomical forces influence our climate changes. And the distinguished scientist from MIT, Richard Lindzen, who had produced numerous research papers debunking CO2 theory in the UN's IPCC reports. Two more heroes emerged from the University of Alabama, John Christie and Roy Spencer, who used the satellite temperature data to track the temperatures of Earth and understand their fluctuations. And these two men, Anthony Watts and Joseph D'Aleo, meteorologists who have unraveled the ways in which government sloppiness and sleight of hand with the numbers have manipulated temperatures. And how about this father and son team of scientists, the ITSOs, who have worked to explain how carbon dioxide is not only essential to life on Earth, did you hear that? Essential to life on Earth, but the increase from our civilization has actually enhanced the growth of crops and forest. And now in the last couple of years, numerous top scientists have continued to come forward as skeptics about global warming. William Happer, Hal Lewis, and Judith Curry are notables among them.